You probably all know the famous quote, "Computers help me solve the problems I've never had without them." And once again, this has become true during the last years because voting seemed to be so easy, especially for us. And then the computers came in, and the nedap chess computer showed us that it's that it looks fairly easy, but it obviously isn't, and there are lots of problems behind that. And Ulrich Wiesner will talk today about solutions, and as far as I read, about the problems that comes with these solutions. And if that irritates you or confuses you at the moment, I hope he'll clarify things up for us. Thanks again, with a warm welcome for Ulrich.
Yeah, thank you very much. This talk is about attempts to implement secure and auditable and transparent e-voting systems using cryptography. So that's next generation e-voting after nedap and digital pen, probably. And this talk is going to be from a voter's perspective. I'm not an expert in cryptography. And if you are, so please be patient with me. This talk is going to be structured like I'm going to repeat a little bit why is e-voting an issue, why is it so difficult to implement an e-voting system that is acceptable for democratic elections, and what issues do we introduce if we just keep physical copies of the ballots, like introducing a paper trail. Now recently there have been a number of cryptographic solutions suggested, like 3 ballots, punch, scan, bingo voting and others, and I'm going to, on a high level, touch upon each of those and explain what they do and what the concepts, underlying concepts are, and I'm going to discuss whether I think that fixes the issues from a voter's perspective. What's the motivation for that talk? There seems to be a strong community believing that the e-voting issues that we've seen in the past, like with the nedap chess computers, are just because the previous approaches haven't been implemented properly, and that the issues are fixable if we just do it properly. In Germany also, there has been an IT security award this year for a concept called bingo voting, which created quite some media attention. And there just seem to be a number of people who think it's now fixed, let's implement bingo voting and we are done. But I believe it's not that easy. Before I start, I'd like to say thank you. I've been here 2 years ago to talk about the case I filed or wanted to file with the Constitutional Court here in Germany, and to do that I needed 100 signatures from voters, and just here after this session I got something like 80 signatures, but some of you didn't stop collecting, and I got mails with hundreds of signatures, and in the end we had something like 850 signatures. So thank you very much for this. Now, why do we have to deal with e-voting at all? What's the relevance of this topic? Voting computers have been used in polling stations in a number of European countries. In the Netherlands, there was an almost 100% coverage, and that has been discontinued, thanks to Rob. Ireland bought nedap devices for 100% of the polling stations, but decided to never use them. Belgium, I believe, has had 40% coverage, and I think it has been discontinued because the license to use it ran out. but I'm not entirely sure where this is going. France has a 5% coverage, growing. Germany has a 5% coverage. It's with the Federal Constitutional Court now. We had a hearing in October, and we're expecting a decision from the court whether the authorities are going to be allowed to use that in future during the next weeks, not weeks. Voting via the internet is a topic in other countries. In Estonia since 2006, and they're now even looking to vote via mobile phone. In Switzerland, some cantons have used internet voting, and there are discussions and trials in various countries, including the United Kingdom, Austria, Norway, Russia. And now sometimes people say, no, we're discontinuing that, like we had such statements in the UK and in Austria. But I don't think it's completely off the table as long as there's still a sufficient community promoting it. Why is e-voting an issue at all? Well, the democratic election principles are that an election should be verifiable, transparent, secret, and that's all procedural principles that ensure that elections are free, fair, and general. So the values that should be protected are free, fair, and general, and how we achieve that by making them verifiable, transparent, and secret. Now, what is this about? The secrecy of the vote basically ensures the free election. It allows you to choose what your preference is without experiencing any negative personal consequences, and you can't sell your vote. The auditability is a measure of quality assurance. It should ensure that the election result is fair and honest. The audits are typically conducted by the authorities, like recounts, and therefore it can never replace transparency, because you can't just say, hey, let me audit the votes. That's nothing that somebody will allow to you as a voter. And transparency is really the value that's open to voters. It ensures that the election is conducted according to the regulations and principles, and that everybody can verify that. It creates trust. It creates trust in the results, and hence ensures that people believe in the legitimacy of the elected body. It prevents denunciation of the result, so nobody can come and say, yeah, but I don't believe this result is correct, because then you would have to have tampering in front of the public. And transparency can never be delegated to the authorities, because it's taking away this right of everybody to understand that the election is free and fair. If you think, I've never seen that transparency, and I've never attended a poll in an election office, and I've never been participating in an account, well, all the OSCE member states have committed to transparent elections in the Copenhagen Declaration 1990, and there's different ways that has been implemented in different countries. For example, in Germany, anybody can observe elections and counting. So you don't even have to be a citizen, you don't have to be older than 18, you don't have to be registered with any authorities, you don't have to bring your passport, it's just open to everybody, and it's just restricted by means of safety and public order in the polling places. In Austria, for example, it's not a right for everybody to participate, but the parties participating in the election can nominate election witnesses, which then go to the polling station and witness the election on behalf of the parties. And similar concepts are implemented in the UK, for example. The participating parties can nominate election witnesses, and organizations or individuals can register for observation. Now, what is the issue with e-voting? In a paper-based election, you basically have a white box. The ballot box is a passive device. It doesn't do anything to the votes you put in. It doesn't do any processing, so the input will be the output. And if you then witness the counting of the votes, and if you can witness that nobody tampers with the ballot box during the election process, then you can assume that the result will be just dependent on the input and on nothing else. Now, when you switch to e-voting and you have a black box device from a voter's perspective, which collects the votes and stores the votes and counts them afterwards, the thing is you have a secret input because the secrecy of the votes. You have a secret input and you have a secret processing, and there's no way you can audit the result. And that's a fundamental difference from other applications, IT applications you might want to trust, like a cash machine. And with a cash machine, you can always see what the input is, the amount you want to withdraw, what the transactions on your account are, and you don't need to know how the cash machine works to check the result. And that's different with elections because the input, the votes are secret. So the processing is not available, the input is not available. How can I check the output? And it's obvious that if you want to check the output, you have to have a little look at the input. And you have to lift the secrecy by a trusted entity who looks at the input and then ensures that the input and the output are related properly. Why do people want to use e-voting? There's a number of inappropriate reasons which are nevertheless repeated by authorities again and again. One is because they say it's cheaper. That's a questionable statement, but even if it was, that wouldn't be a reason to tamper with the transparency of an election. They also say because we've already spent the money on the equipment. That was actually one argument that they even presented in front of the Constitutional Court. Or because it saves in 1 hour of counting. There's some better reasons which are at least worth discussion. You could implement more complex voting systems, like cumulative voting, where you have multiple votes per voter. And in Germany, for example, we have elections in some areas in southern Germany where people have 50 votes and more. Basically 1 vote per member in the city council you elect. Hamburg and Brandenburg, for example, have 3 to 5 votes per voter. But you can still distribute on multiple candidates, or you can accumulate on one candidate. In other countries, there are preferential election systems, like single transferable vote, or systems where you basically state if candidate A is not successful, then my preference is candidate B. Now, all these voting systems have the feature that counting is then very high effort, and it's probably then prohibitive to use manual counting in these situations. So you have a trade-off between the transparency issues and the benefits of these voting systems. Now, my personal preference here clearly is on preference, because what helps what does a complex sophisticated voting system help if you can't check that the results are correct? But at least that's something that drives the introduction of e-voting. Actually, specifically in Germany, the communities in these noted areas are desperate for, or some of them are desperate for e-voting, because they feel they have well, that's really where the good business case is. Yeah? If you have a lot to count, then automation certainly helps. Yeah? And we will see what that does to some concepts later. Well, the easiest fix to the issues of e-voting suggested is why don't we just keep physical copies? Like, why don't we just scan the ballots, or why don't we just have a paper trail coming out of the e-voting machine, and then we can recount. So paper trail and also the digital pen that was attempted to be introduced in Hamburg follow that concept. And that obviously allows an independent validation of the result, and you can manually count the receipts if you want. But there's a number of issues coming with that. For example, what triggers the recount, which polling stations get audited, who decides that, who makes that decision, when and where is the count conducted, and who has control over the physical copies until the recount. And well, it can probably fix the auditability issue, but it will not fix the transparency issue. Because if you want to implement the transparency piece, you would need to recount in the polling station immediately after the election. Nobody would be allowed to take the ballots away and count later on demand. And that basically kills the business case of e-voting, because if you have to count anyway, then why won't you use e-voting in the first place? Well, and if you just restrict your recount to a sample of the ballot of the polling places, then you can probably maintain your business case, but then you introduce other issues. For example, in Hamburg, the authorities suggested that the recount should be a fixed percentage of 1.5% of the polling stations. And that should act as a proof of the correctness of the election devices, of the digital pens, for once and forever. But there's obviously a number of issues coming with that. The sample would need to be truly random to prevent fraud in the polling stations where you don't audit. And the sample size would need to depend on the outcome, because the closer the election result is, the less votes you need to flip, and the more you need to audit to actually find any tampering. So which sample size ensures a high probability that you can detect fraud? That's an easy problem for a race with just two candidates, like in US president election. You just look at the number of votes you need to flip to change the results, and you can then make an estimate how big your sample needs to be, and what the probability is to actually detect any tampering with that approach. Now, it's more difficult in a multi-party, multi-coalition scenario. For example, in Germany, we have a 5% threshold for a party to be elected. And in Hesse in 2008, the party, the Linke, just passed this threshold by 3,600 votes. That's about 1 vote per polling station. And that's actually not very much and difficult to detect. And then when you normally would need 25,000 votes to flip a seat, in this scenario, there were 53 seats for the two conservative parties, CDU and FDP, and there were 57 seats for the other parties, which are more left-wing. And so you would need to switch 3 seats to change the outcome of the election. But actually, if you just flip these 3,600 votes for Linke, then they would not make it into the parliament, and their seats would be redistributed to the other parties. And then the CDU FDP would have won the election with just 1 vote per polling station. There's other issues with keeping physical copies. What do you do if the electronic results and the audit don't match? which result is used. City of Hamburg suggested that the electronic results should be binding rather than the hand count. So why do you then order in the first place? And what do you do if you find a mismatch? Do you have to increase the sample size? It's all things that people have not spent much time on. Also, if you create your physical copies with a printer, you introduce a tempest problem, and it gets very difficult to protect the secrecy of the vote. Also, companies like nedap said they would never introduce a paper trail because the printers fail and create paper jam. Well, that's probably not our issue, but the vendors. But it's one that was created or mentioned. Now, would it not be much more elegant to introduce transparencies through cryptographic methods? And the idea basically is we use cryptography to ensure that the election is to ensure the election integrity, and we provide the voter with an encrypted receipt, so the voter can check that the vote is cast as intended and counted as cast, but he still cannot prove to other people how he was how he voted. So he can't sell his vote, and he can't be subject to coercion, which is Nötigung. There have been a number of proposals over the last couple of years, so bingo voting is not the first one. Prêt à voter, 3 ballots, scratch and vote, punch scan, integrity, bingo voting, and vote box are some of them. There's detailed information on each of them in the internet, so just have a look in the internet on more details on this. I'm going to touch on some of them, on 3 ballots, on punch scan, and on bingo voting. They have, all proposals have one in common, that the ballots receive a unique ID, so that's really a big difference to a normal paper election. You have individualized paper ballots or individualized ballots, and this ID could be random or it could be a serial number, and the voter receives a receipt which contains his vote in an encrypted form and the serial ID. All encrypted votes are published, and the voter can verify that his vote is on the list and is on the list in the same way as he casted it. There's some immediate issues that arise from this approach without even looking at the details of these concepts. Can a verification that my vote is counted as cast replace a verification of the entire election? Probably cannot, because it doesn't protect against ballot stuffing. So if you can't observe where the votes come from, then people might just inject additional votes. It does not allow external observers. The only observing persons are the voters. And it also creates the issue, how many voters need to cooperate to actually unveil fraud? And can the cooperation be sabotaged? For example, if I know somebody will not check, can I flip his vote? For example, if I put a waste bin next to the polling place and people who don't want to check just throw the receipt in there, can I collect these receipts and now have an idea which votes I can flip? Or can I make up an organization which pretends to check the vote on your behalf and then collect receipts and tamper with the votes which are related to these receipts? There's other immediate issues like who protects the encryption from being decrypted? So is my vote really secret, and for how long? Who controls and protects the encryption keys? Is the serial random number on my ballot box really, or on my receipt really random, or does it contain any information on the voter's identity or on the vote casted? And coercion might not require that the secret is really broken. Any doubt in the secrecy might enable you to force somebody to elect in a specific way. Who ensures that the receipt is just issued to a single voter, and that people who who have voted the same way don't receive the same receipt. And then you free up serial IDs, which you can then use to vote somebody different, for somebody different. So that's all general issues which are common to all the concepts and which need to be answered by each of these approaches. The first one is really for warm-up. It's probably not even, or Ronald Rivers doesn't even pretend it's cryptography, but it has many of the concepts already in there that are used by the other approaches. The paper ballot has 3 columns, or ballots, and the idea is that you mark every row for every candidate. You make one, you mark once, and the candidates you choose, you mark twice. So first step is you mark every row randomly, and then your candidates you mark twice. And then there's a trusted checker machine which ensures that the vote is valid. So you put that vote into that machine, and it validates the vote so that you only casted as many votes as you should, and that you have a a tick in every row. And then you decide on one of the 3 columns or ballots which you want to keep, and you get a copy of that. And you can take the copy home, and you separate the 3 other ballots and you put them into a ballot box. And the votes are counted as usual, and then obviously you get 3 n votes for n voters just by the random pattern you start with, and then you have additional votes which are due to your selection. All the ballots get published on a bulletin board, and then you use your receipt and you compare it with what's on the bulletin board, and then you can verify that at least a third of your vote is counted as you casted it. And the other 2, you assume that whoever organized the election doesn't know about which of the 3 ballots you took, and so they wouldn't be able which one to tamper. But it's if the voting organization of this checker machine doesn't know which of the 3 receipts you've chosen, then you have a good chance to detect any tampering. Now, Rivers says it's not a cryptographic voting protocol, but however, it basically uses a kind of voter-generated random key. The pattern you start with can be implemented for paper-based and electronic elections. It's really intended, I think, as an academic discussion paper rather than a serious proposal for use in elections. It's not coercion-free. You can sell your vote, or you can be forced to sell your vote, forced to vote in a specific way, because the voter has control over the pattern he makes, and he can, in a typical Bundestag election, for example, with 10 candidates and 10 parties, you have 20 rows, and you have so many possibilities to make a random pattern that you can tell somebody, I'm going to mark my ballot paper like this. And in a polling station with about 1,000 voters, it's extremely unlikely that then somebody else will have any of the 3 requested ballots the same just by accident. There's more issues. It requires trust in the serial numbers being secret and truly random. So it puts the secrecy of the election at risk. It requires trust in the checker and carbon copy mechanism, because if you know which receipt is chosen, which of the 3, then you can tamper with the 2 other ballots and change the ballot as such. It's also an extremely user-unfriendly approach if you get to more complex elections, and if you force people to mark every row to start with, I think that's nothing that really will be appealing to voters. It might enhance auditability. So if you are the voting authority, and if nobody complains, you have a good chance that everything went well and you had no errors in your process. But it doesn't enhance transparency because it requires trust in the checker mechanism rather than in the counting. The integrity of the two ballots that you don't copy is at risk. And why don't you trust the counting in the first place? Before I move on to the 2 other approaches, I'm going to introduce some fundamental concepts, which many of you might be aware of anyway, or better than I am. Mixed nets is one introduced by David Shorm in the early 80s. It's used for many other things than just voting, for email, anonymization, and things like that. In elections, if you want to use mixed nets, you basically you have keys which permute your initial votes. So if I have a candidate B here, then and a candidate A here, then I mix that in the next step with the permutation key, and I can use have many of these keys, and these keys can be controlled by different people, and that's really the key of it, so that nobody really has the entire knowledge to understand how is this information on the left-hand side be transformed in the information on the right-hand side. So I can count something through a mixed net without revealing the anonymity of the vote. Rivas and others in 2002 have suggested to use these mixed nets in e-voting in 2002, and they've introduced something like what they call randomized partial checking. And what you do is you look at a pair of keys or pair of servers or whatever you want to call it, and if you go to the middle column here, to the information in the middle column, you throw a dice for each of these bits or information pieces, and you either then check and open the left-hand side of the connection or the right-hand side. So if there's some, and then you compare the values on both sides, and if you have the same in both boxes, then nobody tampered with. And so if somebody changes something, you have a 50% chance to detect it, because you either have to change it here or you have to change it here to tamper with the outcome. So for every vote flip, you have a 50% chance to find that in the audit. So to get away with n flip votes, you have a probability of 2 to the minus nth, and that's quite, with a relatively low n, this is already a relatively low chance. So it maintains the secret of the vote despite of an audit. Another concept is commitments, and there's some math below it, and I don't want to go into too much detail, but the math you use is basically that this formula, g to the ith modulo p with any integer I, and with a prime p, creates a permutation of your values. So if I is between, if g is 3 and p is 7, and I is between 0 and 5, then the values for 3 to the ith is this, and and if you do the modulo 7, then you basically get a permutation of your initial numbers. So it creates a pseudo-random permutation of your initial sequence. And for large primes, it's very difficult to solve for I with a given C and a given G. Now, you can use that to commit to a secret. Commit in terms of that you can't change it after you've revealed some information. So if you have two large primes, P and Q divides P minus 1, and you have a private key A, and you have a public key H, which is G to the 8th modulus P, and you can commit to a secret X by choosing a random R and publish a C which is calculated like that, and if you reveal then R and X, the receiver can verify that you actually didn't change your X after you committed to the secret. That's not very intuitive, and I'm not expecting anybody here who hasn't dealt with that before to at first glance understand what this is about, but it gives you a feeling on what complex or how complex and how mathematical the tools are that are used in cryptography. And if you introduce cryptography into elections, then basically if somebody wants to understand that his vote is secret and to understand that he can check his the integrity of the election, he needs to go to that math, and that's nothing that you explain your grandma on a beer tap. Now, David Shorm introduced punch scan in 2006, and how does that work? It basically consists of two superimposed sheets, so a blue one at the bottom and a white one at the top, and you have 4 candidates here, and each candidate has a random number next to it. And these random numbers appear in 3 holes from the underneath layer. And if you look carefully, this random order here is different than this random order here. So, and the ballot sheet has a serial number again, and when you vote, you mark your candidate. In this case, candidate A, you mark it at the top and the bottom sheet. And then you separate the sheets and put one in the ballot box and take one home. And none of the two allows you to prove how you voted. So if you look at the top one, because this order here of the numbers was random, it doesn't give you any information what you voted, and same at the bottom. You voted for 4, what that is, you don't know with the other half of the sheet. And obviously you can't count that without knowing how that hangs together, but you can hide that information in a mix net, and you can commit to the corresponding value through randomized partial checking. And then in the end, all receipts are published on a bulletin board, and you can go to that bulletin board after the election and check whether your vote is there as you casted it. Now, the initial version of PunchScan was not protected against coercion, and that's because if you have a 2-candidate race here with 2 candidates, and you force somebody, or you give an award to somebody to either bring the top layer with a 1 assigned to candidate A and the left hole marked, or you bring the bottom layer where the 1 appears in the left and is marked, then you have in 3 of the 4 cases you're actually able to fulfill that requirement, and in 2 of the cases you've actually voted for candidate B, and only in 1 you have voted for candidate A. So you can incentivize people to vote in a certain way. Now, if you have more than one candidate, that attack weakens, but it doesn't go away. And it's because, well, the reason for that is that you first mark and then you make the choice whether to keep the top or the bottom letter. If you have to make that commitment before you see the ballot sheet, that attack goes away, and that's basically then punch scan 2. But even though this attack is not is resolved, it indicates one issue that is very important with all these cryptographic methods, and that is the sequence of events is very important. So who commits first to the next action is essential for the secrecy, for the integrity of the approach. Scantegrity is a successor of punch scan of the same group of authors. It's a similar concept, but not on one sheet, but all on one sheet. There's random codes next to the candidate names, and then the ballot paper is scanned, and the codes related to the chosen candidates are published. And there's a second version of that where you only uncover the random codes of the chosen candidates, but not of the others. And that introduces an easier complaint validation process, because you don't know the codes of the candidates you didn't choose. But what's interesting is that the same authors who published the first approach, punch scan, then felt the need to introduce subsequent versions or subsequent approaches. So something that was meant as a serious proposal in the first place then wasn't good enough later. Bingo voting is by a German team in 2007, and that's a little different approach. You have a preparation phase where for each voter you prepare a random number for every candidate, and they call that dummy votes. So basically you have a pool of random numbers here for candidate A and for candidate B, and they all get committed to with a method, with one of these commitment methods I briefly talked about before, and then they're shuffled and published on a bulletin board. Now, in the voting phase, the voter selects a candidate, in this case, candidate A, and there's a trusted random number generator who pulls a new random number, and that's where the name bingo voting is coming from. Bingo, like they're suggesting a mechanical random device to make sure it's really random or trusted random. Now, when they did a proof of concept for a University of Karlsruhe election, they didn't use a bingo cage, they used an electronic device. So the trust random number generator creates a random number, and you receive a receipt which has this trusted random number next to the candidate you chose, and random number from the pool next to the other candidates. So you basically, by voting for candidate A, you are reducing the number of remaining random numbers for each candidate. And the receipt you take home, and the receipt is also published on the bulletin board, and you go home and you check that your vote has been, or that your receipt appears on the bulletin board. Now, how do you determine the results? you just count the remaining dummy votes in the initial pool, because now you've used 3 votes for candidate B, C, and D. They have 1 vote less than the others. In the post-voting phase, you publish the results, you publish all receipts, you list all the unused dummy votes and corresponding commitments, and you prove that every unopened commitment was used on one receipt. And you make use of randomized partial checking again. There's a real-world implementation for the Student Council in Karlsruhe, and there's also Java code published. However, that code doesn't compile because there's an object missing. And the code comes with no documentation and doesn't use any Java docs, so it's really, you have to invest a lot of time to have a closer look, but perhaps some of you have the time or have fun with playing with this a little bit. Sorry? Sorry? Well, you make that decision. If the random number is not random, then votes can be stolen. For example, if you have dummy votes A, B, C, and D, and the voter 1 votes for candidate A, so you use your random number 1, and the receipt will contain random number 1 and B1 and C1 and D1. And if then the second voter votes for candidate B, the receipt will contain the random number 2 and the dummy votes A2, C2, D2. And if then the voter 3 votes for candidate A, you can represent the first random number to him again and give him a receipt with R1, B1, C1, D1, which is the same as for the first voter. And if he looks it up, then he will be able to find his receipt, and he won't have any concerns. And you can publish a third receipt with anything you like, and the third random number, and the vote has flipped to C in this case, without the voter 3 being aware of that. So what you really have here is a transformation of the problem. If you don't use that, you have to trust the counting. If you apply bingo voting, you have to trust the random nature of the random generator. There's also real-world hassles, like the commitments are only binding if they're really shared and if somebody looks at them. So if you publish the commitments for each ballot, for each polling station individually, which there are 80,000 in Germany, then you can have a look who downloads what, and if there's any polling places where nobody downloads everything, then you flip the votes in this polling place and reissue the initial commitments. There's general issues which are common to all the approaches. One is concept versus implementation. A secure concept doesn't ensure a secure implementation. For example, randomness. The random nature of a pretended random value can never be verified by an observer. You can only ensure that random is truly random if you know how the randomness is created. But you can't, when you see random numbers, you can never see whether there's any hidden information in there. And there's no solution for that. One example is also the Debian OpenSSH implementation, which is a good example for a good concept and a poor implementation. Until May 2008, there were only 32,000 different keys created. So what if you later find out that your implementation wasn't secure? If you publish votes on a bulletin board, then you can't unpublish that later. So if you find out that you haven't encrypted properly due to implementation issues, you can't hide the information anymore. And there's the user versus administration issue. So even if the concept is secure and the code is shared, like in open source, the fact that the production system really runs the same code is typically not verifiable by the user. So you either need to be an administrator or trust the administrators. Another issue is, are there evil implementations of the secure concept that, from a user's perspective, have the same user interface? So is the secure concept really running? Or is it something that just mocks up the user interface? And also, can I fool inexperienced users, for example, by swapping the sequence of user interactions, by swapping who commits first to something, the machine or the voter? Also, you introduce a denunciation attack. If you are the voting authorities and you don't like the outcome of the election, you can just publish something else on the bulletin board. So you can manipulate the bulletin board without manipulating the outcome of the election. The voters checking their receipts will find mismatch between the receipt on paper and published. And so you have evidence that the unwanted outcome is a result of tampering, and you can then arrest the usual suspects. That works for all protocols where the receipts are published. And I don't see any way around that. Also, you have Alice and Bob, the usual candidates, versus reality. In real world scenarios, you have more than candidates Alice and Bob. For example, Werder is a city here 35 kilometers from Berlin with a population of 23,000 people. And in the city council election in 2008, they elected 29 city council members. And there were 8 parties and 109 candidates competing for these seats, with 3 votes per voter and cumulative voting, so you could give all the 3 votes to the same candidate. And in Frankfurt am Main, in the city council election 2006, there were 93 city council members, and there were 11 parties and 643 candidates competing. And you had 93 votes per voter and cumulative voting with a maximum of 3 votes per candidate. Now, this is really where the business case for e-voting is. Yeah? If you have to count 93 votes per voter, then that's where you want help where you would like help from electronic counting. Now, let's have a look on how that works with the cryptographic approaches we've seen here. For Werder, you have these 3 votes and 109 candidates. So with 3 ballots, you mark 324 rows once, and you mark 3 rows twice. For punch scan, you have 327 holes. At the best, in best case, 109 groups of 3, and they are in random order. So, good luck with finding your candidate. And with bingo voting, your receipt will contain 327 random numbers, and you check 3 of the 327 random numbers for correctness. Now, go to Frankfurt. With 3 ballots, you mark 1,800 rows once and 93 twice. Have fun with checking. With punch scan, you have 1,929 holes, and in best case, 643 groups of 3, and they are in random order. And you're finding 93 candidates, and that becomes serious work, I think. With bingo voting, your receipt will contain 1,929 random numbers, of which you check 93 for correctness. Have a nice half day in the ballot place then. Scrutiny. What happens in case of dispute? Who can evaluate and understand the integrity of an election? Probably the test process is easy, but who understands what's underneath? So who understands the math, and who can evaluate or challenge the cryptographic method and ensure it ensures integrity? If something like this goes to court, this becomes a battle between experts, and it's no longer resolvable by scrutiny committees or judges. To conclude, the core issues with e-voting is the combination of secret input of votes and the black box process. And with every attempt to fix this, and to fix the auditability or transparency issues, you have to take something away from the secrecy, and you have to look at the input, and you have to have a trusted entity that then ensures the secrecy of the vote, and that puts the secrecy of the vote at risk. So you're trading in secrecy for auditability and transparency. Can cryptography fix it? I think it's an interesting academic problem, but academic world is where this topic should remain, and play around with it, but not with elections. The usability of the described cryptographic methods collapses when e-voting has its biggest strengths: many votes, cumulative voting, and for simpler election systems, the added level of complexity is disproportional to the benefits of e-voting. So there we can continue to use hand counting and have full transparency of what's happening. And even if cryptography fixes the auditability, transparency remains an issue because the methods are too complex, and the purpose of transparency is that the voter have no doubt about the integrity of the voting system. And this goal cannot be achieved with methods that Alice and Bob cannot understand. And this is from yesterday's Frankfurter Allgemeine. And it's on the 2009 elections in Germany, and the waiter says, have you already chosen? And this guy here says, that's not any of your business. Okay, I think I've probably used most of my time, but if there's any questions or comments.
I have one question. Yeah, I'm here. What is the risk? I mean, the exposure when when an election is bought. I mean, what would someone could gain from frauding the federal elections here?
What somebody gains from buying votes?
The potential gain.
Well, changing the outcome, I guess. What did I miss the question?
Well, the question is, what is the potential loss to the voters when somebody buys an election or defrauds? I mean, if you control the government here, what could you gain from it in monetary?
Well, you can probably remain in business even if you are not elected by the majority anymore.
So what if I want a mechanical help for voting? You've said the example in Frankfurt, you have almost 100 votes, and it is an issue to count all them. Is there any solution, or do you say electronic voting is dead per concept?
Predicting the future is always difficult, isn't it? So in the moment I'd say there's no appropriate tools which ensure transparency and enable electronic counting, other than having paper receipts and counting them in full immediately after the election. So if you don't like the complex election because it's too much, the complex election system because it's too much work, then well, the solution probably is to switch to an easier system, to a more simpler system.
So at the moment there is no idea how to tackle this problem.
So I couldn't hear that.
So at the moment, there's no idea how to make a workable system.
Well, paper ballots are a working system and
Yes, of
proven
course,
many
beside them.
times. Yeah.
Sorry, folks, could you please keep the noise level a little down? There are people that want to listen to the question and answer session. Thanks.
Maybe you've already answered this question, but I didn't realize it. What people are the ones that select these techniques for working on the outside?
Well, I guess if you refer to the cryptographic methods, I think we haven't seen them anywhere in political elections. That is on the concept level now. If your question is referring to who selects e-voting products that are out there on the market, in Germany, it's the municipalities which make the decision to purchase or not purchase electronic devices which are certified by the Ministry of Interior. Does that answer your question?
Of course.
Sorry, it's me. Okay. Wouldn't a lot of those methods, like the punch cards and so on, fail just because, for example, in some regions you could make coercion by choosing a specific region and just pay people to vote at random? For example, always punch the first hole in a very conservative or liberal region.
Yeah, I think that's one of the attacks that have been proposed against PunchScan, yeah.
Do you have some comments on the current discussion with the Federal Constitutional Court about these issues? Is there anything of the cryptographic stuff mentioned during the in the open discussion?
Well, one of the authors was in the hearing as an expert, but he didn't make any comments on this proposed cryptographic methods. So the hearing was really about the real-life nedap issue.
Me?
Can you tell me anything about the motivation behind the research? Because it seems that it is a nice occupational therapy for researchers into the cryptography stuff, but I do not see any advantage in contrast to the traditional voting methods, as you said before.
Well, if I was in cryptography, which I'm not, I would probably think it's an interesting topic. And if people want to play around with it and want to fix this issue with secret input and secret processing, how can I make that auditable? Why not, as long as they don't use it in real elections for the time being?
Well, you now have demonstrated quite clearly that both those electronic approaches do not work because they necessarily lack transparency. And on the other hand, you said that there is a real existing problem with voting procedures so complex that they need an inordinate amount of time to get counted. So, are you aware of any methods to count paper-cast votes faster in a more efficient way, so that both things get both done in the correct way without undue delay?
No, I'm not. I guess if you want an election system which involves heavy counting, then you have to invest the time in counting it.
So that concludes the question and answer session. So thanks again to Ulrich.
Thank you.